Hello and welcome again. In this second segment of the presentation, having looked at stereotypes, having outlined some of the details of stereotypes about the Balkans, I want to try to begin to answer the question of where some of these stereotypes come from, how they're derived, and what uses that they have. So in the first iteration of this, I'm going to put the accent on culture. That is to talk about how stereotypes derive from perceptions about culture, how this set of perceptions of culture fits into a system of perceptions that is already familiar to history and to social science. How they have a kind of political purpose, or a purpose in justifying or elaborating a kind of distribution of power, and then talking about some of the ways in which the experience of this and the articulation of this is unique in relation, or relatively unique in relation, to the Balkans. So first, we've looked at a bunch of stereotypes, but what are stereotypes? Here's something that I could suggest. That is that every stereotype is based on at least two postulates. First, it is based on a postulate of distinction. That is, a contention that not all people are the same. There are differences between them, and some of these differences can be described in categorical ways that tend to impose a kind of character on the members of one of the groups. The second postulate of every stereotype is that this inequality is not simple diversity. It is not just about the multiplicity of various types of character, or various types of people, but it always carries with it a postulate of inequality, that the purpose of the stereotype is to justify the dominant role of one group of people over another group of people. How does this operate? Well, it might be possible to say that that these stereotypes develop historically, and they develop through the encounter of different groups of people with processes of modernization and different positions that different groups of people take in processes of modernization. I think, I could be wrong here, but give it a try, that if you go through just about every stereotype that you know, any way in which you can think of that that a group of people is characterized as having some kind of qualities that are unique to that group, the basic contention is always going to be this: the contention that some people are more civilized than others. So every stereotype is either a contention that the members of a group are more civilized, or a contention that members of the group are less civilized. Now, this can also be constructed both positively and negatively, right? I mean, it could mean that the less civilized group is backward, is less well informed, has lesser capacity, and so on. Or it can be constructed in a positive way, that the members of the less civilized group are more authentic, are more spontaneous, have a kind of intelligence and cleverness that's unrelated to formal education. But either way, they postulate essential differences, and they put these differences in the context of history. They put these differences in the context of political power. And if we want to talk about stereotypes as they apply to regions of the world, this is an idea that was developed by the literary theorist Edward Said in his classic study on Orientalism, in which he says, knowledge about the East in the West, that is, knowledge in the centers of global empires about the places that are dominated by global empires, relies upon the postulation of difference, relies upon a contention that the people who are dominated should be dominated, will inevitably be dominated, because of qualities attributed to their character and to their culture, lack of development, lack of work ethic, and so on. So all of the science about the East that develops in the West is fundamentally stereotype, and stereotype in the service of power. The historian Maria Todorova develops this idea in relation to the Balkans and talks about the imaginary ways in which the Balkans are perceived in the West. The quotation that you see here, the first quotation on the slide, is from her book Imagining the Balkans, and she argues that the Western perception of the Balkans is not quite Orientalism. The Balkans are not an area dominated by Western empires in the same way that parts of Asia and Africa are dominated by Western empires, but talks about it as a kind of demi-Orientalism, a postulate of difference that extends ideas of inequality and uses them to justify inequality. And so she says that the Balkans become this sort of part of Europe that is not quite Europe, that is a repository of the past of Europe, inclined to join the community but not ready to join the community, and that this is done both by association to rough landscapes, as we've seen in the examples of stereotypes, and in terms of relations to history. Now, this argument is further developed by some other analysts and historians, like the historian Larry Wolff, who talks about the development of the idea of the East as the other of the West, and because of this role is able to constitute the West. That is to say, in order for the West to exist, there has to be a conception of something that is not West, to which it can be contrasted, and this is what the region of the world, this is the role that it plays in the development of identities. And then Milica Bakić-Hayden, in her analysis, moves the analysis from relations between East and West to looking at the East, and she says within the East, there is a west of the East and there is an east of the East. That is, if the whole region is Balkan, then some parts of the region are more Balkan than others and some less Balkan than others, so that the same distinctions that are made between East and West on a global scale are made between East and West within the East. There is a west of the East and an east of the East, and a similar stereotypical conception of differential value that is postulated between these, so that the stereotypes that are created and imposed from outside are recapitulated from inside. Now, what all of this has to relate to on a broader scale is culture and perceptions of culture. And I've just used a big word there, culture. What do we mean when we say culture? Well, the anthropologist Hervé Varenne has compiled a collection of definitions of culture. I'm not going to go into detail on all of those definitions. If you want to look at his 50+ definitions of culture that he's collected from the literature, I've given you a link there on the slide. You can go through them. I'm not going to talk about all of them. That would be a separate lecture in itself. But I could say that the definitions of culture fit into some broad categories. First, the idea of culture as an environment that people live in, and that what makes a group of people a collective is that they all live in a similarly structured environment of culture. Okay. The second is culture as opposed to nature. That is, nature is the things that are given to people by the environment, and culture is the set of things that people make out of the environment. So this is culture as artistic production, all of the things that people make, the art, the poetry, the films, the machines, and so on, that they do distinctively in different parts of the world, which is why we're able to talk, for example, about a certain kind of cuisine from a certain country, or the art of a certain country or region, and so on. Okay, The third general category of definitions of culture is that culture is a way in which people in an environment share meaning. They have symbols in common, they have interpretations in common, and they're able to recognize one another by the fact that these are common and shared and constitute ways that people communicate with one another. Now, add to this the perception that cultural difference exists and that there are different levels of value attributed to different types of culture, this is where you get to the kind of insight that is made by sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu. That culture, your tastes, your preferences, your assembly of meanings in the world serve to identify you, and they can identify you in a way that makes you more likely to be accepted and more likely to benefit from social systems of inequality, or less likely. So culture is something that you can use to advance yourself, but more important, culture is something that can be used against you in the sense that it is mobilized to identify some groups of people as being in some way different in a negative sense, or deficient. And this is why, for example, entry into some professional positions is dictated by things like possession of the right set of tastes and practices. We can go into detail on this, but this is maybe something that we will do better in discussion. Now, if we want then to talk specifically about the Balkans, here are some dimensions of culture that are important and that are used against the Balkans, both from outside and from inside. One is the perception of backwardness. And this is important, as we've seen, in attribution of identities from outside, and also important from inside. If you really want to insult somebody in any one of the Balkan societies, then the way you would insult them is by calling them primitive, by calling them a peasant, by calling them backward. That is, that this distinction is brought between culture and the lack of culture. I've identified it here using terms from Serbo-Croatian, kultura and nekultura, and this is the basic line of division, is between people who want to establish themselves as possessing authority because of their access to culture, and people who are dismissed and excluded from positions of authority and recognition because of the attribution that's made of them of lacking culture. And the reverse of this also applies. That is that the distinction is made between people who authentically represent the real local place in their self-perception, and ones who are perceived as being inauthentic. That is, their claim to culture is dismissed because it's seen as coming from outside, as not being representative of the region. Now, what all of this amounts to then is, within this complex of perceptions of culture, a set of stereotypes that are imposed from outside and often internalized within the social environment. They add up to a sense of anxiety and uncertainty that's expressed throughout the culture. So what we want to talk about is, if we understand then the stereotypes in the context of culture and in the complex of systems within which culture operates, which includes historical elements, which includes political elements, stereotypes matter because they interact with the life and the life chances of people in the environment.